Well, welcome. Tonight we have a person who is one of those special people. Not just somebody with an opinion, but somebody who gets up and says, put me in, let me try and make changes, and let me affect the lives of everybody in the Commonwealth. So why don't we start with an introduction?
Hi, so thanks so much for having me. I'm Quentin Palfrey. I'm thrilled to be here with you. I'm a candidate for Attorney General. I'm a Democrat. I'm proud to have the endorsement of the Democratic Party at the state convention. And I grew up in central Massachusetts. I grew up in Southborough. My parents are pediatricians, and I grew up watching them serve some of the most vulnerable communities in Massachusetts. And I've had the honor to serve in the Attorney General's office as an Assistant Attorney General. I was the first chief of the healthcare division in the AG office at the time that we were implementing Massachusetts health reform. So I saw firsthand how much impact the office can have. I think we're in an extraordinary time in American history. We've got a Supreme Court undermining our civil rights. We've got a democracy that's literally under attack. I feel like as we watch these January 6th hearings, we're seeing history unfold before our eyes in a very dangerous way. And it was really inspiring under the Trump administration to see the AG fight back again and again against that corrupt and immoral administration. But I think it's really important in this moment for the AG to take on some of the really big challenges we face: the climate crisis, attacks on our democracy, attacks on workers' rights, housing costs, gun violence. We've got a lot of challenges in America right now, and a lot of challenges, here in Massachusetts. And so, as the Attorney General, I'd like to take on some of those really big challenges. I mentioned healthcare. I think the healthcare system doesn't work very well for a lot of people. Drugs cost too much. It's too hard to access care. We tend to underinvest in preventative care, maybe mental health services, substance use services. And I was the first chief of the healthcare division in the AG office as we were trying to reform the healthcare system. And I remember that we had a hotline in the office, and we would hear consumer complaints. People would come to the office and talk about some of the challenges they were facing. And one of the challenges that we heard over and over again was people saying that their insurance company had lied to them. There were these companies that were offering low-cost health insurance, and they would say, look, it's a pretty good deal. We won't charge you very much. And then they would get cancer, or their family members would get cancer or some other kind of a problem, and they would learn too late that that wasn't covered. This was in the sort of 2006, 2007 kind of time range. And so we investigated those cases, and we decided that they were breaking the law. And so we sued them. And over the course of a couple of years of lawsuits, we got a very big recovery for Massachusetts consumers, about $17 million. But we also kicked 3 of the worst actors out of Massachusetts that had been lying to consumers. And I think you can see, some of that predatory behavior still happens. The AG recently sued Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family for some of their lies that contributed so much to this opioid crisis, has had a lot of impact on Milford and communities all across Massachusetts. So I think making sure that the AG is a consumer advocate, particularly in the healthcare space, is really important. I also think the AG can play a really big role in helping to build an economy that works for everyone. So, we have an economy right now that really works best for very, very rich people and for big corporations. And, too much of the rest of the population is left behind. I've been working on these issues for a long time. I had the great honor to serve in the White House under President Barack Obama. I was the senior advisor for jobs and competitiveness, and worked really hard on some of the issues around the sort of jobs and industries of the future, and trying to make sure that we're sort of broadening out some of that economic prosperity. And so some of that kind of approach that I'd like to take to the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General can really be an advocate for workers. There's an issue in Massachusetts that we call wage theft, where workers don't get the benefits and the hours and the payments that they're entitled to. Some estimates say this is about $1 billion a year problem. And so really standing up for fair labor practices and for workers is a really big part of what we want to do in the Attorney General's office. We see this relatively large fight with companies like Uber and Lyft, who are trying to misclassify workers and take away their benefits. There was going to be a ballot initiative on that set of issues. It actually got knocked out by the Supreme Judicial Court. But I think that there are some really big structural issues in the gig economy, and making sure that workers have the right to collective bargaining. There's a ballot initiative this year called the Fair Share Amendment, which is going to ask very, very wealthy people to pay a little bit more so we can invest in transportation and in education. And both of those, I think, are really important for people in Milford and people all across Massachusetts. In Boston right now, we're seeing the Orange Line shut down.
And the Green Line coming too.
And the Green Line as well, and all of the infrastructure in the greater Boston area is going to be snarled up with those problems, which I've called for an investigation into how we got there. I think the AG office looked into, if you remember, when the tunnel collapsed and killed a woman, the AG launched an investigation. I've called for an investigation into how we've gotten to the point with the Orange Line where it was on fire. There was a woman who was dragged by one of the trains. There was a train that had to stop, and people had to get out and walk through a tunnel that was quite dangerous. And so, I think there's real public safety challenges and civil rights challenges and just, real problems with our transportation system. But it's not limited to those dramatic, incidents of a train on fire. Out here, it's just too hard to get around. People need their transportation system to work well in order to have economic opportunity. The other part of that conversation, so I talked about education, I talked about transportation, there's also this issue around education. We have an education system that has a lot of inequality in it. So where you live, the color of your skin shouldn't determine what kind of an education you get. We're about 68 years after Brown versus Board of Education, that major U.S. Supreme Court case that said that separate but equal was not good enough. But we still have very racially segregated schools in this state. We also have a ton of inequality. So a school system like Southbridge, and certainly school systems in Worcester, school systems in Lawrence and Brockton and elsewhere, they're really big challenges and lots of inequality there that I think the Attorney General's office should take on as a civil rights issue. I care a lot about the climate crisis. What we do or fail to do on this issue right now is going to determine what kind of life our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren live. I have 3 kids. I care very much about their futures. I'm sure most people do. We've had this very hot summer, and I think people have an intuitive sense of how real the climate crisis is. But, as I've been studying this issue, somebody said that this is the hottest summer we've ever had. It is also the coolest summer we will ever have for the rest of our lives. The climate change is real. It's hitting our communities very rapidly, and we need to move very quickly to clean and renewable sources of energy. I was very pleased to see Congress take a big step forward with this Inflation Reduction Act, but it has a lot of clean energy measures. It looks like Beacon Hill is going to actually pass a big bill that will incentivize clean and renewable energy. But the AG has a very big role to play in moving urgently towards solutions to the climate crisis. And some of that is suing polluters, but other parts of that are our work overseeing the utilities sector, our work on some of the civil rights issues and environmental justice issues. And then, we have a platform, and we need to use it to push for urgent action on the climate crisis. I mentioned at the beginning concerns with the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has become a very political and radicalized body at this point. And I was outraged at the Dobbs opinion that reversed 50 years of jurisprudence around abortion rights. We've had some of the best laws in the country right here in Massachusetts, and we need to continue to show that leadership as people are going to be fleeing other states, fleeing bounty hunters. I mean, it's just shocking where we are on this conversation in this country. The AG needs to crack down on some of these crisis pregnancy centers that are lying to people about their options. But there's also this broader threat, and you can see it in Justice Thomas's concurrence in that Dobbs opinion, that this is the beginning of a series of attacks on civil rights, on the way that we've sort of thought about the law and its protections. You can see potential attacks on LGBTQ rights, on equal marriage, on the right to contraception, even on interracial marriage. So all of those things are on the table.
Quentin, do you really believe that the people would tolerate that?
I don't believe that it's tolerable, but I think it's going to be people like us standing up and saying it's unacceptable, just in the way that with the Dobbs opinion, we've had mobilization and people have been outraged, and we need people to vote for candidates who are going to support abortion rights. We're going to need that kind of mobilization around gender-affirming care, for example. You see the Texas Attorney General starting to treat gender-affirming care as child abuse. You certainly see some signs of attacks on LGBTQ rights in other parts of the country.
Let me play devil's advocate. Why do we need to change anything in Massachusetts, or do we? Roe v. Wade got pushed down to a state level. Is it really going to have an effect on people in Massachusetts?
So I think that there are challenges that we're going to need to face here in Massachusetts as a result of the Dobbs opinion. Some of those challenges relate to people coming in from out of state and making sure that they're able to get the care that they want. Some of those things are going to be in relation to our providers. Some of the laws that are being passed in other states, sort of purport to cover the behavior of healthcare providers out of state. So we're going to need to protect them from that kind of attack. We've got these crisis pregnancy centers, as I mentioned. There's also, access challenges. So we've got what you call abortion deserts, which is to say large distances between providers. And, there are challenges with access in terms of insurance. So I think we have some work to do, but I think the broader question is how do we make sure that we are standing up for these rights? How do we push back on the national level? How do we work with other states to reinforce the right to abortion access?
But do other states have the right to dictate what happens in Massachusetts?
I don't believe they do, but sometimes they try, right?
Oh.
Sometimes they try. They pass these laws that say that if you assist somebody in seeking abortion care, that you may be subject to their jurisdiction, and so there may be legal issues there. There's also, it's just terrifying, but there's this issue of these bounty hunters that they've tried to empower to enforce their laws out of state, and there's also a lot of privacy issues. For instance, I've done some work on apps on phones that collect information from people and share it with third parties. Let's say you're using an app to help you get pregnant. You're collecting information about ovulation, about other really intimate kinds of information. It turns out that sometimes there's an overcollection of that information. It's shared with third parties. We're now starting to see subpoenas from law enforcement for some of that data in connection with cases with new anti-abortion laws. So there's a whole
Isn't
new
that covered
front.
by HIPAA?
It's not because it's not that information is not created in the medical context. So people don't. HIPAA actually is a lot narrower than people think. It governs the provision of medical care, and if you're using an app for your own private purposes and interacting with a commercial entity, it's in the spirit of what HIPAA
But even
would
though that's
cover.
about my medical condition?
You would think that it would be covered, and I would love to see Congress create greater protections there, but it turns out that that's covered by the general set of rules around commercial data privacy, and they're not as protected.
And you mentioned the Supreme Court is looking to expand its reach, like contraception.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm confused, but
It's shocking and upsetting, but there's a really radical set of beliefs among what is now a majority in this Supreme Court. So let's step back. A lot of the rights that the Supreme Court has articulated in the last 60 or 70 years around abortion and contraception and other kinds of sort of sexual activity come out of the 14th Amendment, and they come out of a set of interpretations around the 14th Amendment. The way that the Roe decision was decided was to say that implicit in the 14th Amendment there was this right to privacy. That very same set of doctrines is responsible for another series of cases. There's a case that upholds the right to equal marriage, to same-sex sexual activity, to accessing contraception, and to Loving versus Virginia, which is a case that relates to interracial marriage, that struck down a law in Virginia that prohibited people of different races from marrying one another. So they all kind of are in the same part of the Constitution and the same part of constitutional interpretation. When the Dobbs opinion was initially leaked, remember when it was leaked before it was actually put out? In the leaked opinion, there was an indication that they were attacking not only Roe and Casey, which was the case that came after it, but also all of these other precedents that I'm talking about. The final Dobbs decision doesn't contain that language, but Justice Clarence Thomas, who's quite a conservative justice and I think sees the world in a similar way to the way that Alito and Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett and some of the other really...
Well, the voting's made that clear.
Yeah, that Thomas wrote a concurring opinion, and his concurring opinion in Dobbs, which is to say I agree with the outcome, but let me sort of tell you some of my own thinking. He took direct aim at these other cases around contraception, around equal marriage, around interracial marriage. And so you can kind of see where his mind is anyway.
But do you believe, I mean, especially in the Commonwealth here, when you talk about mixed marriages, I mean, I grew up and I went to my mother and said I was getting married. She said, okay. I said, Mom, it's a mixed marriage. She says, really? I said, yes, she's not Portuguese.
Yeah.
You know, my family was all Portuguese. To them, not marrying a Portuguese girl was a mixed marriage. But all kidding aside, why would I have the right to even...
It's shocking. It really is. But, you know, let me put it to you this way, okay? There are things that 5 years ago I thought were not within, the realm of the possible. Children in cages, collusion between a president of the United States and a foreign adversary, an armed mob storming the Capitol to try and disrupt the peaceful transition of power. a former president of the United States taking nuclear secrets after he's left office. There are things that we didn't think were possible a few years ago. And I didn't think that Roe versus Wade was going to get overturned, at least until we saw, what was happening with Kavanaugh and some of those opinions. I guess we saw it coming in that sense. But I think we do need to be ready for what such a radical group of justices having such a strong hold on the federal judiciary could mean for the law. And we don't want to be naive about how many challenges we're going to face from that U.S. Supreme Court. And we will need the state of Massachusetts to be able to stand up against those kinds of challenges. And it's not just in this space. Let me mention another couple of really upsetting opinions that have come down recently. There's an opinion in the environmental space that's going to undermine the ability to regulate. There's an opinion in the gun violence space that is going to make it more difficult for states like Massachusetts to rein in gun violence, and so we're in a really dangerous time in terms of the direction of our courts. There also, and this goes back a little bit farther, but I've been very concerned about a number of Supreme Court cases around money in politics. So you're familiar with Citizens United, but Citizens United is a decision of the U.S. Supreme Court about a little bit more than a decade ago that opened up the floodgates for corporate money to come into our elections. And I would suggest that that is responsible for a lot of the things that are not working well in our system of government right now. So, for example, if you're asking yourself after Uvalde, for example, mass shootings, we had this horrible mass shooting at Sandy Hook almost a decade ago. Why don't you see more action at the federal level to ban assault weapons or to have background checks? These are things that are actually very popular among the public. Some of these things are even popular among gun owners. And why won't Congress act? And the answer is really very simple. It's because of the power of the NRA. Where does the power of the NRA come from? It comes from corporate money in our elections. Let's take the climate crisis, for example. Why have we not seen more rapid movement towards clean and renewable sources of energy? And the answer, quite simply, is the power of some of these oil and gas companies over our elections, and that comes directly from the way that corporate donors are allowed to influence our elections. The same is true with banking. The same is true with pharmaceuticals. So
let me play devil's advocate. How do you finance your campaign?
So I'm running a really grassroots-oriented campaign, and so much so that I am entitled to public financing in this system. So Massachusetts has a system that if you're willing to swear off and agree to certain spending limits, and if there's money available, and there happen to be because of where I'm running for a significant office, and it turns out that there was some money available for that. My donations to my campaign are actually matched up to $250, and I'm going to have about $250,000 worth of public financing because I'm a clean elections candidate in this race. So I've raised more than $500,000 of grassroots donations from individuals, but I'm also entitled to this public financing, and it's a way of counterbalancing the effect of money in politics. So one of my opponents. It is a part of the Massachusetts election system.
No, but I mean, as far as other candidates.
So there's only one other candidate running for office this year who
for your office.
I'm the only one in my race. There's
Okay.
One of the lieutenant governor candidates is also in the public financing system, but it counterbalances some of the other pieces of this. So I've got an opponent who is self-financing her campaign, and she set as a limit on what she might spend $12 million of her own money. She's already spent, I think, in the ballpark of $4 million voters already in this race. I have another opponent who, so let me step back. There's something called the People's Pledge, and the People's Pledge is something that Elizabeth Warren and Scott Brown set up on a bipartisan basis to try to get outside money out of elections after Citizens United. They wanted to keep the super PACs out, so they made this agreement. We proposed that in this race to say, let's keep the super PACs out. Let's keep that outside money out. One of my opponents agreed with me to sign that. One of my opponents did not. The opponent who did not had recently been supported by super PACs in her mayor's race, and so we certainly have had some concerns about that outside money.
Does that work in Massachusetts? Because I remember when we had our House rep election years ago, and all of a sudden my mailbox was full of this fecal matter that you could tell was not local.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's kind of like when the mayor of New York City said he's sending New Yorkers down to Texas.
Yep.
And I sat there and said, wait a minute. I wouldn't want that.
So I think you're absolutely right. And, I think a good example of this is that Mike Bloomberg is not president. Do you remember how much money Mike Bloomberg put into that presidential race? For a while, you could not turn on a television
without seeing him.
Yeah, and in spite of how much money he put into that election, he did not win any state primaries. And there was a brief period of time where that huge influx of money caused his numbers to go up a little bit. But at the end of the day, the voters were pretty smart, and they were able to see through that approach. I really like data and evidence. I'm just, it's kind of person I am. I, have studied a lot of, what works and what doesn't in various areas. And in elections, what you see in the evidence is very clear, which is that human connection is deeply important to persuading voters. So the most persuasive thing for a voter is to meet a candidate. There's nothing better. The second best thing is for somebody who meets a candidate to talk to their family and friends, right? That if you say, if somebody in your family says, hey, I met this guy or this woman and, they're running for office, I think they're great. That's very persuasive. Next most persuasive thing, you talk to your neighbors. Maybe they're not, people but you knock on doors, get a human connection. Human connection over a telephone can be somewhat persuasive. The farther you get away from that direct human contact, the weaker the persuasive impact. So once you start having robocalls, once you start doing mass emails, these mass texts, these big...
But am I the only one that gets turned off by that?
No, exactly. No, you're exactly right. The farther you get from the human connection, the worse and worse it gets, until eventually it really doesn't have that much effect, other than name ID. The one thing that it does help with is if voters don't know your name, it's helpful to have the tools to be able to introduce yourself to voters.
Now, you mentioned you have 3 kids.
I do. 13, 11, and 5.
Oh, the great years.
Yeah.
Boys or girls?
So I have 2 boys and a girl. So my 13-year-old is named Drew. He's a boy. And then Serena's 11 and Max is 5.
I'll get in trouble for saying something sexist, but the daughter, the joy of my life for my 2 daughters, because they'll never abandon their dad.
Yeah.
To this day, as I became more rotund, my oldest comes to the house now every day to make sure that we go to the gym for 30 minutes a day.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
And you sit there and say, anything we can invest in our kids, to me is wonderful investment.
Yeah, it's the greatest joy of my life, and I'm proud of them, and I really enjoy being able to spend time with them. And it's been hard being on the campaign trail. I don't get quite as much time with them as I normally do, but I still make a real priority of spending time with them every day. And
Now, you mentioned that there's an inequality in education. Now, I thought the state leveled a lot of that out, because I know Milford gets 47 cents on the dollar we spend on education, and there's other cities around that get up to 80 cents. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How is it so dramatically different?
Yeah, there is, there's a complicated funding formula that does try to rebalance because, a lot of education money comes from property taxes, and then there's what's called the foundation budget. And actually, recently, the legislature changed the formula and made it a little bit more equitable and fair. But I'll tell you, there are still very stunning differences in terms of the educational opportunities that kids receive. Some of it's about money, and money is very, very important. But there are other challenges too. One of the things we were talking about data, one of the things you see is that a lot of the inequalities, already exist before kindergarten. That a lot of things come out of some of the structural racism and cyclical inequalities in our economy, and are deeply interwoven with with transportation and housing and economic opportunity and other pieces of that. But the result is that we have deeply unequal schooling opportunities, and we have deeply unequal opportunities in other parts of our economy, and you can see it in lots of different ways.
Is it economic mainly? I mean, when you say it's racial, I feel pretty good that in Milford we care about one color, red. If you bleed Milford red, then we take care of you as best we can. It doesn't matter in my mind where you came from, what you believe in. Milford red is what counts.
Yeah, that's the way it should be. Absolutely. I just think if you look at a number of the parts of our society, there are real racial disparities. So think about our voting system. The way I got involved with, I mentioned I worked for President Obama. The way I got involved with President Obama is I was involved with voting rights efforts in some of his campaign work. So I ran the voter protection effort for him in Ohio. For example, in 2008. And I don't know if you remember, Ohio around that time often had these really long lines in the African American communities. People would often wait 3 or 4 hours to vote. Some of them wouldn't have a chance to vote at all. I'll tell you, I vote in Weston. I don't think I've ever waited more than 5 minutes to vote. I think that we see, and Massachusetts has some of these challenges as well, but there are challenges all over the country, that, in this country, there are just obstacles to registering and voting and having your vote count that are different depending on where you're from and the color of your skin. We see that in almost every section.
But
right?
inadvertently, didn't Trump help us with that? I mean, when he started screaming, the election is rigged, I remember looking at my darling bride saying, he's going to help us have the cleanest election. Because if I'm in charge of the election in Massachusetts, and I've got somebody nationally saying it's going to be rigged, aren't I going to go out of my way to make sure it's as clean as possible?
We have well-run elections in Massachusetts. There's some challenges, some things that I would like to change. In particular, I'd like to see election day registration passed. But we have very good elections in Massachusetts. But I think we shouldn't be naive about the threats that we face to our democracy right now. In a number of states, there was an overt effort to undermine the credibility of the counts and to send electors to be counted that were competing slates of electors. I think that we've seen some of those folks emboldened over the last couple of years. So if you're looking at the Republican primaries this year, candidates running for office in states all over the country who believe or claim that Biden rigged the election in 2020 are winning Republican primaries. There are states that are trying to change their laws to be able to give the state legislatures more control over choosing electors. The Supreme Court may well take up a law or a decision that would give more power to state legislators to do that. So there are real challenges. And then if you think about gerrymandering, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but gerrymandering.
We lived in the banana precinct.
Absolutely.
Poor Richie Neal used to come out here, and we always joked about Milford was this end. He was almost out to Springfield, I said, what does one part of your district have to do with the other?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's exactly right. And, in a lot of parts of the country, legislators choose their own districts. They choose them to be very, very safe. And then that really distorts the incentives for those representatives to represent their communities. And so there are a lot of challenges to our democracy.
But
Some
the
of those.
people who went crazy and said, this is rigged, maybe I'm not informed correctly, but I thought all of those challenges went to proving how strong and clean the election was.
Well, that's the way I think about it too, and certainly the allegations that the Trump aligned people made in the 2020 election were ridiculous and disproven. I think that we're just in a very difficult time in America right now, where fact checkers and journalists and academics saying that something is a debunked argument doesn't always penetrate into the sort of right-wing conspiracy theory kind of world online. And, there are a lot of people who believe, in spite of all evidence to the contrary, some of these QAnon theories and some of the theories that President Trump and his allies were promulgating. And unfortunately, that's festered and continues to fester in parts of
Well,
this
I have to admit, I get in my car in the morning, I turn on Fox News. Halfway to work, I turn on CNN. Because I figure somewhere in the middle is where reality exists.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I have to admit that I think that most of Fox News is actual propaganda. I think there is a lack of journalistic integrity there, and there's a real effort on the part of Fox News, and Rupert Murdoch, I think is responsible for a lot of this to distort the conversation. And so I have to say, I don't think that the truth is halfway between Fox News and CNN a lot of the time. But
Well, I don't believe either side totally.
yeah,
How far in the middle it is,
yeah.
You talk about asking people to pay more money.
Mhm.
Now, I mean, I was amazed when I found out that 50% of the students in Milford High School get free lunch, which means their parents are living on $34,000 or less for a family of four. How you can survive on $34,000, I find amazing with, two children. But I'm struggling with the idea that if somebody's paying $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 that they're in taxes, that they're not paying enough. How do I rationalize that?
Yeah, so I think that we have an economy over the last 20 or 30 years where the concentration of wealth in not just the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1% has just so dramatically increased. And a lot of that has to do with our tax laws. A lot of that has to do with the way that our economy is structured. But the ultra rich, the very, very, very wealthy. I'm not talking about people who have enough to send their kids to college, the people who, maybe have paid off their home, maybe they're going to have a comfortable retirement. I'm talking about the sort of, 2 yachts, 6 cars, 4 houses kinds of rich. You've got an economy where more and more of the power and more of the money is getting concentrated in the very, very top. And it's not good for our system. We need to use our tax laws and other kinds of incentives to broaden the economic prosperity. That is going to mean, and so if you take this Fair Share Amendment, for example, you're not talking about, your ordinary person or even a fairly wealthy individual doing well as a doctor, a lawyer, a banker, an entrepreneur. If you're earning more than $1 million in income per year, And if you excuse the first $1 million in income per year, I'm not talking about $1 million if you're like, this is the valuation of your house and
This
how
is
much you got in
income.
you're talking about income in a year, and you're excluding the first $1 million. After that, you have a little bit of an increment going up, where you pay a little bit more than you currently do off of the 100,000 on top of your first $1 million per year. That even if you make $1.1 million, actually isn't going to hit you that hard. But you make $10 million a year, you make $50 million a year, all of a sudden, that money's going to add up a little bit. But people who have that kind of income are really capable of giving a little bit more so that we can invest in transportation and education. And that's really not going to limit their ability to send their kids to school, to have a comfortable retirement, to enjoy the fruits of their
So
hard
it'll
work.
be $1 million of income a year plus.
Exactly.
Because every time I ask somebody, what's a definition of somebody who's rich? It's somebody who makes $1 more than I do.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure if your income statement is 7 figures, you probably can afford a little bit more so that the trains aren't on fire.
Okay. Now, when we start looking at gun control, you mentioned, what would your office do to help gun control? Because I'm a gun owner. I bought my first gun when I was a teenager, and I just haven't been able to part with it. But I remember when the trigger law came out. I went out and bought a trigger guard because the law said I should have one. I don't know of how many drug dealers on the corner with their pistols went out and followed the law.
Sure.
So, there's things that I'm confused at. If you came to me and said, I need to buy a gun today, I don't know, in my old manner, that would send up, my antenna would go straight up. Why today? If you're going to a gun show this weekend, you got a week to get vetted or whatever. So I guess I don't understand. What can you do?
Yeah, well, so Massachusetts has some of the best gun laws in the country, and we've had some of the best results in terms of the gun violence epidemic. And part of that is that we've been pretty reasonable about this. You need a license to drive a car. That doesn't mean you don't have freedom or liberty to move around. It just means that there's reasonable rules around it. And I don't think that you need an assault weapon to hunt or to defend your home or to shoot at a target, to be a sports person on the weekend. If you're doing those things, you're doing fine. You don't need an assault weapon for that. And so I think it's reasonable that we don't allow assault weapons for civilian use. I'd like to see us work with other states to prevent some of those weapons from coming into Massachusetts, because sometimes they find their way in. I'd like to see us crack down.
But they don't find their way in legally, do they?
No, not legally. No. We just need to, the Attorney General is part of the law enforcement community, and so we need to make sure that we're protecting.
Because you bring up assault weapons for hunting.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, we'd go deer hunting.
Yeah.
I had 3 shells.
Yeah. Exactly.
That was for the weekend.
Yeah, right. So I mean, nobody's talking about reasonable hunting, home defense, those kinds of things. That's not what's on the table. I think, for instance, let me talk about these 3D printed guns. Are you familiar with these?
The ghost guns.
Yeah, ghost guns. I mean, I think that's something that, they don't have serial numbers. They're not detectable.
They're not traceable.
We've got to crack down on those. I think we ought to do more about manufacturing of at this moment, you are allowed to manufacture in Massachusetts assault weapons that you can't sell to civilians here. I think that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'd like to see us invest more in suicide prevention. We now have this extreme risk prevention order called a red flag bill that give some tools to people to say somebody's a risk to themselves, somebody's a risk to others. I think that's reasonable, and we.
But if I'm not a risk, You know, I always thought, if you came to my house and said, I want to search your house for heroin, please, have at it. I have nothing to do with drugs. I wouldn't worry. So these red flag issues, are they being abused? Is that the problem?
No, I think it's a good law. I think it's a good law. We passed it a couple of years ago, and I think just having an opportunity to identify somebody who's a risk to themselves or to others early enough so that we can give them some help, I think makes a lot of sense. So, you know, I think Massachusetts has it right, and I think the right balance. And you know, there's some things that I'd like to do, you know, around bulk purchases of guns, you know, armories. You know, at a certain point, you know, do you really need 50 guns? You know, do you need them? You know, and it's so you know, I think that there's some things that we can do around sort of reasonable restrictions. We can do more to hold gun manufacturers accountable when there are you know, obvious consequences to what they're doing. But I think on the whole, you know, I think that Massachusetts has had a very successful approach to gun violence, and we should do more of what's working.
Is it because of our political nature? I mean, I've always felt comfortable that I have a hard time telling the difference between a liberal Massachusetts Republican and a conservative Massachusetts Democrat. That's that middle ground that when I go out to the square states, I don't see a lot of commonality. Are we fortunate that Massachusetts does work together?
Yeah, Massachusetts is a wonderful state, and we have a wonderful political culture here. And you know, look, I think you know, I identify as very strongly as a Democrat and even as a progressive Democrat. But I will say that sometimes these labels get in the way of human connection. And you know, what I've found is when you go into people's living rooms and into their you know, into you know, people's communities and get to know what people want. They want the same things most of the time. They want a good future for their children. They want, you know, a stable retirement, and you know, they want a good job. You know, they want health care. You know, they want a clean environment. You know, they want to be safe, and they want to be treated fairly. And so I think that, you know, a lot of times in the sort of national cable news environment and talk radio and on the internet, you know, there's a lot of incentive to, you know, to scream at each other and to find things that we differ on. But I think if you're a decent human being and, you know, you sort of meet people where they are, we share a lot of the same values. And, you know, I think that what we're pushing for in terms of the agenda that I'm talking about, healthcare for everybody, a good job, clean environment. I think these are things that a lot of people, regardless of sort of how they describe themselves politically or ideologically, can come around to supporting. The other thing I would say is that, you know, I think fundamental decency is really important in politics. And, you know, I had the honor to work for Obama. And it was one of the things I most admired about him and also about First Lady Michelle Obama was just the tone that they took in terms of dealing with other people, you know, dealing with their staff. He was very respectful when I had interactions with him and with First Lady, but also just when they were criticized. I remember Deval Patrick used to talk about disagreeing without being disagreeable. And, you know, I've noticed somebody I respect and admire, Michelle Wu, I think, you know, sort of handles herself with that kind of grace and poise. And, you know, I think that in this political culture, too often, you know, people are, you know, antagonistic and don't act towards each other in the ways that we would want our children to emulate. And so one of the things that I think that we should strive to do, even when we disagree, is to try to behave like the grown-ups that we want to be, and also just sort of our children are watching, right? And it was one of the things that I found just sort of many things that I found disturbing about the Trump administration, but that kind of decency in how you treat other people didn't seem to always be present in the tone of that administration, and I think that was a departure even from Republican administrations.
But
in
now
the
you
past.
mentioned health care.
Mhm.
Are we doing okay in health care in the Commonwealth?
I don't think so. I think that I'm proud of the leadership role that Massachusetts has played in healthcare. I think we have some of the best healthcare institutions in the world, and some of the best life sciences industries in the world. So there's a ton of innovation that comes out of Massachusetts. So I think we have a lot to be proud of. But I think that there's some really big challenges in our healthcare system. Let me mention a few of them. The first is that we spend too much of our economy on healthcare. So we spend about $1 out of every $5 on healthcare in this system, and yet we get results that are worse than some countries that spend quite a bit less, even sort of 14-15% of GDP. We underinvest in things like prevention, so public health challenges like chronic diseases, diabetes, obesity, asthma, mental health, substance use disorder. We need to do a better job of preventing problems, keeping people healthy, and spend less in the healthcare system itself. There are huge racial disparities, and we were talking about this in education, but there are very big differences between the health conditions for people of color, how they access the healthcare system, and their outcomes within the healthcare systems, and we can document this statistically. And then there are all these access challenges. One of them is that drugs cost too much. I know that in this community there are people who pay too high a percentage of their income just to take the medicines that they want to take. It can often be hard, even when you're insured, to afford the health care that you're receiving. And there are real shortages of trained nursing staff, of doctors and certain
What
prevention.
can the AG do to affect that?
Well, actually, there's a lot the AG can do to affect that. It's an interesting role for the Attorney General. So I mentioned I was the first chief of the healthcare division in the AG office. And I mentioned some of the things that we did in the consumer protection space, like suing insurance companies and pharma companies. And that's an important part of the role. The AG's role actually is quite a bit broader than that. And let me mention a few examples. One of them is that the legislature, in its wisdom, continuously puts the AG into a role of being involved in some of the health policy entities. So gives appointees to the AG to Health Policy Commission. When I was in the AG office, I sat on something called the Quality and Cost Council. AG has a number of appointees to the Connector Board. I was on something called the Racial Disparities Council. I was on the board of something called the Betsy Lehman Center. So you end up being involved in a lot of these policy-making entities, sort of in a quasi-legislative role. There's also a role in overseeing nonprofit organizations. So a lot of the healthcare institutions in Massachusetts are organized as charities. So Blue Cross Blue Shield, for example, is a charity. Partners, which is now MGH Brigham.
Man's greatest hospital.
Yeah, is a nonprofit, is a charity. Harvard University and MIT are also charities, nonprofit organizations. Well, the Attorney General's office is the regulator of nonprofits and sits, and is responsible for making sure that nonprofit organizations are actually fulfilling their charitable mission. And so there are opportunities through that role to encourage the use of community benefits, investing in communities like Milford, making sure that we're taking on some of the public health challenges that I was talking about. There's also a role in enforcing antitrust laws. So one of the things that ends up happening with healthcare institutions is sometimes they merge, sometimes they consolidate, sometimes they break up too. And when they merge, sometimes that causes a couple of different challenges. One of the challenges...
Prices don't typically go down then.
Prices don't typically go down, and that is one of the roles that the AG plays in regulating the healthcare markets, is to make sure that the consumers don't get harmed. Another ways that consumers can get harmed is when it leads to less coverage. So sometimes when hospitals close or hospitals merge, services that had previously been provided to communities go away, and that can create real challenges. The AG also plays a role in the insurance market. So a lot of that is under the Commissioner of Insurance and is part of the executive functions of the governor's office. But the AG actually plays a role with the insurance commissioner in rate setting, procedures, and in making sure that the insurance system works well. So it turns out that the AG is one of the most active players in health policy and can have a lot of impact on making sure that the healthcare system works for people. And one of the roles that you should play as AG is as a consumer advocate, as a workers advocate, as a civil rights voice. Certainly, advocating for businesses, advocating for the system as a whole to work. But, a lot of the times those businesses have very strong voices of their own, and so consumers really need a voice in those conversations.
I hate to do this, but I have to ask you the final question.
Sure.
When I'm from Milford, why should I vote for you?
So look, I think that we're in an important time, and I think that I have the experience of being a former assistant attorney general, and as having led a large team of lawyers in the federal government, and I think that the attorney general's office is a really important role. And I think we need somebody who can step in there on day one and help to tackle the kinds of challenges and concerns that people in Milford and people all across the Commonwealth have. And that's, good jobs and access to healthcare and a clean environment. I also think that having grown up in central Massachusetts, I understand that too often Beacon Hill forgets that communities like Milford exist, and I am committed to being engaged with this community, being an ally and an advocate for Milford in the State House. Make sure that you're getting the resources and the attention from the Attorney General's office that this community deserves. I also, I am independent of special interests, and we talked about clean elections, but I think it's really important to have an Attorney General who works for you, who's the people's lawyer, who can take on those big companies when necessary, who can fight against insurance companies or pharmaceutical companies or big banks or others if they're taking advantage of communities like Milford. So I think having a candidate who's independent, who's willing to take on those special interests, really puts me in a position to be able to perform that role for you.
Well, I thank you for coming here and letting us know who you are and what you stand for.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was a ton of fun.
And to our 6 loyal viewers, as always, I've committed I'd never ask you to vote for any specific candidate, but I will reserve the right to beg you to get out and vote. Get to know the candidates, pick one that feels right to you, that is like you, that you believe, especially here, the people's lawyer, will advocate for things that are important to you. And then please get out and vote, especially now that we have voting by mail, voting in person, voting by carrier pigeon, just about any way you can. There's a way to vote, and please do so. And as always, to our 6 loyal viewers, may God bless. May tomorrow be a better night than tonight. Thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Far too long since I've been home. Been running all my life just